Somewhere over contested airspace, a military aircraft's GPS suddenly goes dark, jammed by an adversary's electronic warfare system, leaving the crew flying blind through of the most dangerous, heavily contested skies on the planet. This is not a hypothetical scenario dreamed up for a Pentagon slideshow. It has already happened in the real world, forcing real pilots to rely on backup navigation systems that are nowhere near as precise as GPS itself. The Pentagon's answer to this exact, well-documented vulnerability now has a name: Project Farseer, a $200 million crash program specifically designed to put quantum physics into the hands of ordinary soldiers, pilots, and sailors within the next 2 years. This is not distant theoretical research locked away in a university laboratory somewhere. This is a formal, funded, deadline-driven military acquisition program, with a specific date already circled on the calendar, backed by real money and real institutional urgency at the very highest levels of the American defense establishment. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what Project Farseer is, why the Pentagon suddenly decided quantum sensors could no longer wait for the normal, notoriously slow defense acquisition process, what specific technical challenges this program is actually trying to solve, and what this entire effort reveals about the increasingly urgent technological race unfolding between the United States and its rivals. To understand why Project Farseer exists at all, you first need to understand the specific vulnerability it was built to address. And that vulnerability starts with GPS, the satellite-based navigation system that modern militaries, along with the entire global economy, have quietly come to depend on for almost everything. GPS works by using precisely timed signals broadcast from satellites orbiting far above the Earth. But those signals are relatively weak by the time they reach the ground, which makes them genuinely vulnerable to jamming, a form of electronic warfare, where an adversary simply floods the airwaves with noise powerful enough to drown out the legitimate satellite signal entirely. Reports have already confirmed real-world incidents where jamming, suspected to originate from Russian military systems, has actively interfered with aircraft navigation in contested regions, forcing pilots to rely on considerably less precise backup systems in the middle of active flight operations. For a military that has spent decades building its entire way of fighting around precise, GPS-enabled vulnerability represents a genuinely serious operational problem, one that becomes considerably more dangerous as potential. Adversaries continue investing heavily in exactly this kind of electronic warfare capability specifically designed to blind American forces. At the moment they need clear navigation the most, it is worth appreciating just how deeply embedded GPS dependency has become across nearly every aspect of modern military operations, precisely because that pervasive dependency is exactly what makes this particular vulnerability so strategically significant in the first place. Modern precision-guided munitions rely heavily on GPS signals to strike their targets accurately. Military logistics networks depend on GPS timing signals to coordinate the movement of supplies and personnel across vast distances. And even routine communications between different military units frequently depend on the precise timing signals GPS satellites broadcast continuously to synchronize otherwise independent systems. When adversaries successfully jam or degrade these signals across a contested battle space, the resulting disruption ripples outward across nearly every connected military system simultaneously, not merely affecting the specific aircraft or vehicle whose navigation display suddenly goes dark. This is precisely why senior military planners have grown increasingly concerned about what they describe as a single point of failure running through the entire modern American way of war, a risk that quantum sensing technology specifically promises to address by providing navigation and timing capabilities that simply do not depend on any external signal an adversary could potentially jam, spoof, or otherwise disrupt from a distance. This is precisely where quantum sensing technology enters the picture because it offers something genuinely different from anything the military has relied on before: navigation and detection capabilities that do not depend on external satellite signals at all. Quantum sensors work by exploiting extraordinarily delicate physical phenomena, things like atomic superposition and quantum entanglement, properties that make certain measurements dramatically more sensitive and precise than anything achievable using conventional classical instruments. A quantum inertial navigation system, for example, can track an aircraft's or a ship's precise movement through space using nothing but onboard atomic sensors, without ever needing to receive a single external signal from a satellite that an adversary could potentially jam or spoof. This particular technology has already moved well beyond pure theory. In flight testing, a working out Quantum navigation system reportedly achieved positioning accuracy up to 111 times better than a high-end conventional inertial navigation system operating without GPS, a demonstrated real-world result rather than a hopeful laboratory projection buried inside an academic research paper somewhere, and a figure the Pentagon itself has publicly cited, rather than merely alluding to in vague terms. The underlying physics making this level of precision possible is genuinely remarkable, even if the full mathematical details quickly become far too complex for anything beyond a specialized physics course. At the most basic level, quantum sensors exploit the fact that individual atoms, when carefully isolated and manipulated using lasers, behave according to the strange rules of quantum mechanics rather than the more familiar rules governing everyday objects we can see and touch. An atom can exist in a superposition of multiple states simultaneously, and when that same atom experiences an external force, whether from gravity, acceleration, or magnetic field, that force affects the atom's quantum state in an extraordinarily precise and measurable way. By carefully tracking these subtle quantum state changes across a cloud of specially prepared atoms, engineers can construct instruments capable of detecting forces and movements with a level of sensitivity that would be genuinely impossible using any purely classical, mechanical sensing approach. A difference in kind, rather than merely a difference in degree compared to conventional navigation instruments. The same fundamental technique, known broadly as atom interferometry, underlies both the quantum gravimeters used to detect subtle variations in gravitational pull and the quantum inertial navigation systems capable of tracking precise movement without any external reference signal whatsoever. None of this represents entirely new science. The fundamental physics of quantum superposition and entanglement that make this kind of sensing possible were actually worked out by physicists across the middle of the 20th century. And practical atom interferometry itself was first experimentally demonstrated back in the 1990s, decades before Project Farseer's own formal launch. What has changed dramatically in more recent years is not the underlying physics itself, which has remained essentially settled and well understood for decades, but rather the engineering maturity required to actually miniaturize this delicate laboratory-scale technology into something rugged and compact enough to survive, being strapped onto a military aircraft, ship, or ground vehicle operating in genuinely harsh, unpredictable, real-world conditions rather than a carefully controlled, climate-stabilized university physics laboratory. That specific engineering gap, transitioning from a delicate laboratory demonstration into field-ready military hardware, has historically proven far more stubborn and time-consuming to close than the underlying physics itself, which is precisely the specific gap Project Farseer was created to finally close on an accelerated timeline. If you're finding this breakdown genuinely fascinating so far, take a second to like and subscribe, because this channel covers exactly this kind of quiet but consequential military technology story, the ones unfolding right now that most people never hear about until years later. Project Farseer itself was formally launched in June of 2026 by the Defense Innovation Unit, a Pentagon organization specifically created to move faster than the traditional, notoriously slow defense acquisition process typically allows, cutting through the years of bureaucratic red tape that normally separates a promising new technology from an actual piece of equipment soldiers can carry into the field. The program carries a formal internal designation, and it operates with up to $200 million in available funding, structured through something called Other Transactions Authority, a special legal mechanism that allows the Pentagon to sign flexible, rapid contracts with technology companies without going through the lengthy, cumbersome traditional procurement process normally required for major defense acquisitions. Crucially, the same legal authority allows successful prototypes developed during Farseer's testing phase to jump directly into large-scale follow-on production contracts without needing to restart an entirely new, separate competitive bidding process from scratch, dramatically compressing the timeline between a promising laboratory demonstration and genuine large-scale battlefield deployment. This particular contracting mechanism deserves a bit more explanation because it represents a genuinely significant departure from how the Pentagon has traditionally acquired new military technology throughout most of its modern history. Other transactions. Authority was originally created by Congress specifically to give the Department of Defense a faster, more flexible alternative to the traditional federal acquisition regulation process, an extraordinarily detailed and legally complex set of rules originally designed to ensure fairness and prevent corruption in government contracting, but which critics have long argued also makes it extraordinarily difficult and time-consuming for innovative, smaller companies and civilian technology startups to successfully compete for defense contracts against a small handful of established traditional defense contractors already deeply familiar with navigating that same complex regulatory process. By using Other Transactions Authority specifically, The Defense Innovation Unit can negotiate contracts directly with promising technology companies, including smaller startups and civilian firms that might otherwise never have successfully navigated the traditional defense procurement bureaucracy. Dramatically widening the pool of potential technology providers the Pentagon can actually draw upon for a genuinely urgent, fast-moving program like Project Farseer. This acquisition strategy reflects lessons the Pentagon has been gradually absorbing over the past decade or so, as officials increasingly recognize that some of the most genuinely innovative technology, particularly in rapidly evolving fields like artificial intelligence, commercial space technology, and now quantum sensing, increasingly originates from civilian startups and commercial technology companies, rather than from the small number of large traditional defense contractors that have historically dominated major American weapons programs for decades. The Defense Innovation Unit itself was specifically created years earlier, partly to address exactly this challenge, functioning as a kind of specialized bridge specifically designed to connect promising civilian technology companies with actual military requirements and funding, without forcing those companies to first spend years learning to navigate the traditional defense contracting bureaucracy that has historically discouraged many innovative smaller firms from even attempting to work with the Pentagon in the first place. Firms that might otherwise have simply directed their most promising engineering talent entirely toward commercial markets rather than defense applications. Project Farseer represents one of the more ambitious and well-funded applications of this particular acquisition philosophy, specifically applied to the quantum sensing field, testing whether this faster, more commercially oriented contracting approach can actually deliver genuinely field-ready military hardware within the aggressive multi-year timeline the White House itself specifically mandated through executive order. The program itself is organized around 4 specific technical priorities, which the Pentagon refers to internally as separate lines of effort, each targeting a different category of quantum sensing hardware with its own specific performance requirements. The first line of effort focuses on magnetometers, extraordinarily sensitive instruments capable of detecting minute disturbances in Earth's magnetic field, technology with obvious applications for detecting hidden submarines, buried mines, or underground military installations that would otherwise remain completely invisible to conventional detection methods. The second line of effort focuses on gravimeters, instruments that measure tiny variations in gravitational pull, technology that can reveal hidden underground structures, tunnels, or geological features relevant to military planning and reconnaissance. The third line of effort focuses on precision clocks, since incredibly accurate timekeeping turns out to be absolutely fundamental to modern military operations. Everything from precisely coordinating simultaneous strikes across multiple platforms to maintaining secure, synchronized communications that adversaries cannot easily disrupt or intercept. The fourth and final line of effort focuses on the underlying components and subsystems needed to actually build and integrate all of this specialized quantum hardware into existing military vehicles and weapons platforms without requiring an entirely separate, custom-built infrastructure for every individual piece of equipment. Each of these 4 technical priorities addresses a genuinely distinct operational need worth understanding in a bit more depth. Magnetometer technology specifically matters enormously for anti-submarine warfare, an area where the American military has historically maintained a significant technological advantage over potential adversaries, but one that faces genuine erosion as rival navies continue investing heavily in quieter, harder-to-detect submarine designs specifically engineered to defeat conventional sonar-based detection methods. A sufficiently sensitive quantum magnetometer, capable of detecting the extraordinarily faint magnetic disturbance a submarine's metal hull creates as it moves through the water, could theoretically restore much of that eroding detection advantage, regardless of how quiet an adversary's submarine propulsion system itself has become. Gravimeter technology serves a somewhat different but equally significant purpose, since variations in gravitational pull can reveal underground structures, tunnels, or geological formations invisible to virtually every other conventional surveillance method technology, with obvious applications for identifying hardened underground military facilities that adversaries have deliberately built specifically to evade conventional aerial or satellite reconnaissance. Precision timing technology, the third line of effort, might initially sound less dramatic than detecting hidden submarines or underground bunkers, but it arguably underlies more of modern military capability than either of those other 2 applications combined. Nearly every precision-guided weapon, every coordinated multi-platform strike, and every secure military communication system ultimately depends on extraordinarily precise, perfectly synchronized timing information to function correctly. And currently, much of that timing precision flows directly from GPS satellite signals specifically, the exact same signals vulnerable to jamming that originally motivated this entire program. A sufficiently precise quantum clock, capable of maintaining perfect timing accuracy for extended periods without any external signal whatsoever, would allow military platforms to maintain that same critical synchronization even in a heavily jammed, GPS-denied combat environment, addressing perhaps the single most consequential and least publicly discussed vulnerability this entire program was specifically designed to solve. That last requirement, the ability to integrate seamlessly with existing military hardware, turns out to be a critically important and often underappreciated piece of this entire program, because a brilliant piece of quantum technology that cannot actually be installed inside an existing aircraft, ship, or ground vehicle without a complete, expensive redesign of that entire platform provides very little practical military value, no matter how impressive it might look during a laboratory demonstration. To address this specific challenge, Project Farseer requires all submitted technology to adhere strictly to something called Sensor Open Systems Architecture, a standardized set of engineering principles specifically designed to ensure new sensor hardware can be integrated relatively quickly and easily into whatever existing military platform actually needs it, rather than requiring a lengthy, expensive custom integration process for every single new piece of technology the military wants to actually deploy into the field. One of the most genuinely clever aspects of Project Farseer's overall design strategy involves deliberately leaning on civilian, commercial technology that has already solved many of the difficult engineering problems the military itself still needs to solve, rather than trying to build every single piece of this technology entirely from scratch, using purely military research and development funding. The Pentagon has specifically emphasized its interest in dual-use commercial technologies, meaning quantum sensing innovations originally developed for entirely civilian industries like mineral exploration, oil and gas surveying, and advanced medical imaging. Industries that have already invested enormous private sector resources into solving exactly the kind of miniaturization, ruggedization, and power efficiency challenges the military itself desperately needs solved as well. An oil and gas company using quantum gravimetry to locate underground petroleum deposits has, in the course of solving that entirely commercial problem, already worked out many of the same fundamental engineering challenges the military faces in trying to build a compact, rugged quantum gravimeter capable of detecting hidden submarines from an aircraft or a surface vessel. A medical imaging company using quantum magnetometers to map subtle patterns of human brain activity has similarly already pushed the underlying sensitivity of that technology to levels the military itself needs for entirely different, decidedly non-medical battlefield applications, having already invested substantial private capital into miniaturizing and ruggedizing hardware that would otherwise cost the Pentagon years of dedicated research funding to develop entirely from scratch. This dual-use strategy reflects a broader and increasingly important shift in how the Pentagon approaches emerging technology more generally, recognizing that the traditional model of funding purely military-specific research from the very beginning, starting completely from scratch on problems the private sector may have already substantially solved for its own entirely separate commercial reasons, often wastes enormous amounts of both time and taxpayer money-duplicating engineering work that has effectively already been done elsewhere. By specifically targeting civilian companies that have already achieved meaningful commercial success with mature, field-tested quantum sensing hardware, Project Farseer aims to dramatically compress the timeline between an available, already proven civilian technology and an actual deployable piece of military equipment soldiers can carry into genuinely dangerous operational environments. Project Farseer did not emerge out of nowhere, and it connects directly to a broader set of quantum technology policy actions the White House itself set in motion earlier in the same month. On June 22nd of 2026, President Trump signed 2 companion executive orders specifically addressing quantum technology. One focused explicitly on securing the nation against advanced cryptographic attacks by directing a government-wide shift toward new quantum-resistant encryption standards, and a second focused on ushering in what the order itself described as the next frontier of quantum innovation, launching a broader, coordinated federal effort specifically aimed at developing and commercializing quantum computing, quantum sensing, and quantum networking technology simultaneously across the entire government. Together, these 2 executive orders formed a genuinely coherent, unified strategy. One order focused specifically on accelerating America's own offensive and defensive quantum capabilities, while the other focused specifically on defending against the exact same category of security risks that same rapidly advancing quantum technology inevitably creates for everyone, including the United States itself, a genuinely coherent acknowledgement that offensive quantum advantage and defensive quantum vulnerability are ultimately 2 sides of the exact same underlying technological coin. The specific executive order authorizing quantum innovation efforts set an explicit, formal deadline directly tied to Project Farseer's own accelerated timeline, directing the Department of War, the Pentagon's newly adopted formal name under the current administration, to identify at least 3 genuinely next-generation quantum sensor projects within 60 days of the order being signed, and to actually field that resulting technology to real military units no later than September 30th of 2028. That specific hard deadline, set directly by presidential executive order, rather than emerging organically from within the Pentagon's own internal planning process, explains precisely why Project Farseer moves with such unusual urgency compared to typical, far slower defense acquisition programs, since Defense Innovation Unit officials now face direct, White House-level accountability for actually delivering working quantum sensing hardware to real operational military units within a specific, publicly announced window of time, rather than the vague, open-ended, multi-decade research timelines that have historically characterized many earlier military technology development efforts. This entire effort also cannot be properly understood in isolation from the broader geopolitical competition currently unfolding around quantum technology more generally, particularly the Pentagon's own explicit concern about China's rapidly advancing capabilities in this exact same technological space. Chinese researchers have made significant, well-publicized progress across multiple quantum technology fronts throughout 2025 and 2026, including advances in exascale classical supercomputing that some American defense analysts specifically cited as evidence of accelerating Chinese technological momentum across computing and sensing fields more broadly. Momentum American officials clearly worry could eventually translate into a meaningful military advantage if left unanswered by a comparable American response. Quantum sensing specifically carries genuine strategic significance in this broader competitive context, since whichever nation manages to field reliable, battlefield-ready quantum navigation and detection technology first would gain a meaningful operational advantage in exactly the kind of contested, electronically degraded combat environments that many defense planners increasingly believe will define future military conflicts, particularly any potential confrontation involving sophisticated, technologically advanced adversaries capable of seriously contesting American dominance of the electromagnetic spectrum. This competitive dynamic extends well beyond quantum sensing, specifically into a much broader pattern of technological rivalry that has increasingly come to define the overall relationship between Washington and Beijing across nearly every advanced technology sector simultaneously. Chinese state media and research institutions have periodically publicized claimed breakthroughs across quantum computing, quantum communication, and quantum sensing technology throughout recent years, some of which independent Western researchers have later disputed or been unable to fully verify. But the underlying pattern of sustained, heavily funded Chinese government investment across this entire technological space is not seriously in dispute among American defense analysts. China has specifically prioritized quantum technology within its own national economic and military planning documents, treating it as a strategically critical field deserving of substantial, sustained government investment rather than treating it as merely one interesting research area among many competing scientific priorities. This sustained, well-funded Chinese commitment across the broader quantum technology landscape helps explain why American officials increasingly frame quantum sensing specifically, alongside quantum computing and quantum communication more broadly, as a genuine strategic competition rather than simply an interesting area of scientific research, pursued purely for its own sake, without any broader geopolitical significance attached. Some American defense analysts have specifically warned that quantum sensing technology carries a particular kind of strategic urgency that distinguishes it from other emerging military technologies currently being developed, since the specific advantage quantum sensors provide, reliable navigation and detection capability in electromagnetically contested, GPS-denied environments, becomes most valuable precisely during the opening phases of a potential future conflict against a technologically sophisticated adversary, specifically capable of contesting and degrading the electromagnetic spectrum from the very first moments of any confrontation. Unlike some other emerging military technologies, where a temporary capability gap might be manageable or recoverable over the course of an extended conflict, a navigation and detection disadvantage during the critical opening hours of a high-intensity confrontation against a peer-level adversary could prove considerably more difficult to overcome or recover from once a conflict has already begun in earnest, which helps explain the genuine sense of urgency driving Project Farseer's unusually compressed development timeline compared to typical, far slower-moving Pentagon technology programs. ADM Christopher Grady, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has been notably direct in public statements explaining exactly why the Pentagon feels compelled to move this quickly on quantum sensing technology specifically, emphasizing the genuine operational urgency behind Project Farseer's accelerated timeline rather than treating it as merely one more speculative, long-term research investment among many competing Pentagon technology priorities. a framing that leaves little ambiguity about how seriously senior military leadership currently views this particular capability gap. This kind of direct public statement from one of the most senior uniformed officers in the entire American military carries real weight, signaling that Project Farseer represents a genuine, immediate operational priority for military leadership, rather than simply another line item buried deep inside the Pentagon's enormous overall research and development budget. It is worth noting that Project Farseer specifically builds on real, already demonstrated technical progress, rather than representing a purely speculative bet on technology that remains entirely theoretical. In 2025, a strategic-grade quantum inertial sensor was successfully integrated onto and flown aboard a United States Space Force orbital test vehicle, demonstrating conclusively that this kind of delicate, extraordinarily sensitive quantum hardware could actually survive the extreme physical rigors of an orbital rocket launch and continue operating effectively even in the harsh vacuum of space itself. That successful orbital demonstration marked a genuinely significant milestone in this technology's own maturity, transitioning quantum sensing decisively from a purely theoretical laboratory promise into a concrete, operationally proven asset capable of surviving genuinely extreme real-world conditions, well before Project Farseer's own formal launch made headlines throughout the broader technology press in the summer of 2026. That particular orbital demonstration is worth understanding in a bit more detail, because space represents perhaps the single most demanding possible test environment for this kind of delicate quantum hardware, involving violent mechanical vibration during launch, extreme temperature swings, exposure to increased radiation levels beyond Earth's protective atmosphere, and the complete absence of any possibility for hands-on maintenance or adjustment once the sensor has actually reached orbit. A quantum sensor capable of surviving that particular combination of extreme physical stresses while continuing to deliver reliable, accurate measurements represents genuinely convincing evidence that this technology has moved well beyond a delicate laboratory curiosity, requiring constant expert supervision and careful environmental control, and toward something considerably closer to genuinely rugged, field-deployable military hardware. This successful demonstration likely played a meaningful role in giving Pentagon officials and White House policymakers alike the confidence needed to commit real, substantial funding and an aggressive, publicly announced deadline to Project Farseer specifically, rather than continuing to treat quantum sensing purely as a longer-term, more speculative research investment without any specific, concrete, near-term fielding timeline attached to it. Project Farseer also operates alongside a separate but closely related DARPA program, specifically focused on what that agency calls robust quantum sensors, reflecting a broader, coordinated pattern across multiple different Pentagon organizations, all simultaneously prioritizing quantum sensing technology as a genuinely urgent near-term military priority, rather than a purely distant, theoretical research interest confined to a single isolated program. This kind of parallel, multi-agency investment across both the Defense Innovation Unit and DARPA specifically suggests the broader American defense establishment views quantum sensing technology as important enough to fund through multiple overlapping channels simultaneously, rather than betting the entire American quantum sensing effort on just one single program succeeding or failing entirely on its own, a hedging strategy that mirrors how the Pentagon has historically approached other genuinely high stakes, technically uncertain research priorities across its broader portfolio. What makes Project Farseer particularly interesting from a broader strategic perspective is how directly it reflects a fundamental rethinking of how the Pentagon approaches emerging technology procurement more generally, moving decisively away from the traditional, notoriously slow, multi-decade defense acquisition timelines that have historically characterized major American weapons programs, and toward a considerably faster, more commercially oriented model explicitly designed to keep pace with rapidly evolving civilian technology markets, rather than lagging years or even decades behind them. The traditional defense acquisition process, often criticized by defense reform advocates for taking the better part of a decade or even longer to move a promising new technology from initial concept through to genuine, large-scale battlefield deployment, simply cannot keep pace with a technology landscape where meaningful civilian quantum sensing breakthroughs are now emerging on a timescale measured in months rather than years. A mismatch that Project Farseer's flexible contracting authority and aggressive White House mandated deadline were both specifically designed to address directly. There remains genuine, healthy uncertainty about exactly how successfully Project Farseer will ultimately meet its own aggressive September 2028 fielding deadline, since transitioning promising quantum sensing prototypes from successful laboratory and flight test demonstrations into genuinely rugged, reliable, mass-producible military equipment that ordinary soldiers can operate and maintain in the field, without specialized physics expertise, represents a considerably more difficult engineering challenge than simply proving the underlying quantum physics works correctly under carefully controlled test conditions. Defense technology programs throughout history have frequently encountered significant unexpected delays and technical setbacks during precisely this transition from promising prototype to genuinely field-ready, mass-producible equipment, and there is no particular reason to assume quantum sensing technology will prove uniquely immune to exactly these same kinds of engineering and manufacturing challenges that have historically slowed down countless earlier, comparably ambitious military technology programs. Still, the sheer scale and urgency of Washington's current commitment to this particular technology, spanning a dedicated $200 million Defense Innovation Unit program, a parallel DARPA research effort, a specific presidential executive order setting a hard deadline, and direct public statements of support from senior uniformed military leadership, represents a genuinely significant and well-coordinated bet that quantum sensing technology has finally matured enough to move decisively beyond the laboratory and into genuine real-world military deployment within the next several years. Whether Project Farseer ultimately succeeds in meeting its own ambitious 2028 deadline, or whether it instead encounters the kind of unexpected technical delays that have historically slowed down countless earlier defense technology programs, the underlying strategic signal here remains genuinely significant regardless of the program's own ultimate specific timeline. The era of quantum sensing, existing purely as an interesting academic curiosity confined to university physics departments, appears to be decisively ending, replaced by a new era where this exact technology is being actively raced toward the battlefield with real deadlines, real funding, and real strategic stakes attached. There is a genuinely important broader lesson embedded in this entire story that extends well beyond quantum sensing specifically. One about how emerging technology increasingly moves from civilian laboratories into military application in the modern era. For much of the 20th century, cutting-edge military technology frequently originated from dedicated government research programs specifically funded and directed toward military applications from the very outset, with breakthroughs occasionally trickling outward into civilian commercial use only afterward, sometimes years or even decades later. Project Farseer represents something closer to the reverse of that traditional pattern, deliberately seeking out civilian commercial technology that has already matured through purely private sector investment and commercial competition, then rapidly adapting that already proven technology for military purposes through flexible, accelerated contracting mechanisms specifically designed to move at the same speed as the underlying commercial technology market itself. Whether this particular acquisition model ultimately proves successful in meeting Project Farseer's own ambitious 2028 deadline remains to be seen. But the broader strategic bet underlying it, that the fastest path to genuinely field-ready military technology increasingly runs through civilian commercial innovation rather than purely dedicated military research programs, appears likely to shape how the Pentagon approaches emerging technology acquisition well beyond quantum sensing specifically, across nearly every advanced technology field where civilian commercial investment now frequently outpaces traditional, purely military-funded research and development efforts. If this kind of deep dive into the emerging military technology quietly reshaping how future conflicts will actually be fought is exactly the kind of content you want to see more of on this channel, make sure you like and subscribe. Because there's a great deal more of this story still waiting to unfold as Project Farseer moves from its current early development phase toward its own high-stakes 2028 fielding deadline, a deadline that will reveal a great deal about whether this accelerated acquisition model can genuinely deliver on its ambitious promises.